Hello, everyone. Welcome to our training session today. It's September 23rd, 2021. My name is Wendy Rex Atzet. I am the state coordinator for the National History Day program in Utah. And today is the first of two sessions that we are presenting with the help of our friends at the Utah Film Center, focused on documentary making. So teachers, if you are working with kids who want to build a documentary and you haven't supported them in this before, or you have supported them and you'd like to learn more about the filmmaking process, this session and next week's session are for you. I'm going to start off by giving you a quick overview of where you can find program information and content and tools for doing the History Day process with your students. You know, you can find all of our recorded professional development sessions through our Padlet, which you access through our main website, which is here at the Utah Division of State History. And when you scroll down, you'll come to this menu where we have a student toolkit, teacher resources, contests, be a judge, project gallery, and noteworthy. The project gallery here with our little pirate is a great place to send your students to look at projects that other kids have done in the 5 creative categories. This will give them a good sense of what these projects look like when they're finished. The contests tab is the place where you will go to connect to your local district or regional contest, where you can register, learn what their contest dates and scheduling are for the upcoming year. And all of those contests have different dates, different due dates. So you do need to go to the contest that's specific to where you teach and look up that information now so that you have students ready when it's time to register. The teacher resources tab here, I will take you inside this one, connects you with our new teacher toolkit. This has now been converted onto a Padlet form where you can access tools, resources, and other information to help guide your students through the process. And then our student toolkit has just been revised. And so each one of these buttons will take you and your students into a Padlet that will provide them with information on each step in the NHD process. So there are handouts, there are tools, there are guides, there are links to places to do research. It's all been reformatted and presented to you through Padlet as the delivery mode, but you can find everything that you need and maybe a little more on our set of student Padlets in this toolkit. Just one second, I'm going to admit somebody to our meeting. Okay. And then I wanted to say just a little bit about, let me change the view here. There we go. About using the rule book, because we're going to start to focus down on individual creative categories. And when your students get to the point where they're starting to build their project, this is the time to go into the rule book and look at the specifics for the category that they are working in, where there are all kinds of technical specifications for making a documentary, and you want your kids to know what those are before they start building. Okay, and Julie is not going to be focusing on the technical specs for an NHD entry in terms of like the time limit we know is 10 minutes and whatnot. However, you know where to access that because it's in the toolkit and the rule book. There we go. Okay, so that's what I have to say to kick this off. Please access resources as you need them. They're there for you, they're free and they're available. And it's really my great pleasure to introduce to you Julie Gale from the Utah Film Center. Julie.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Wendy, and thank you so much for the Utah State Division of History for letting us come today and be able to support you all. As Wendy mentioned, my name is Julie Gale. I'm the Director of Education here at Utah Film Center, and today we're going to go over some supplemental materials to help your students have really effective and also quality submissions to the Utah History Day competition. I'm going to start sharing my screen, so if you could make me a co-host, Wendy, I'd greatly appreciate that. Okay, I am now the co-host. All right, so I'm just going to move my presentation over here, and then I'll go into presentation mode. All right. So as Wendy mentioned, we're from Utah Film Center, and we have actually been supporting teachers through our teacher professional development since 2015 through our teacher professional development program you may have heard of. It's called SHIFT, where we go into schools. We also do presentations for teachers to teach them how to bring filmmaking into the classroom. And this section is one part of the full curriculum of our teacher professional development program centered around the documentary. Now, what this particular goal for today will be, this is really diagnosed from feedback that teachers have given Wendy and the Utah History Day project over the years that are needs that they have in terms of supporting their students, but also teachers have as far as needs are to help their students get from start to finish with their documentary. So our goals for today will really be focused on quality pre-production will lead to very smooth filming, which is called production, and very smooth and efficient post-production, which is the editing process. In addition to that, this will also support should your students advance to further levels in the Utah History Day competition, and they're getting feedback from adjudicators where they need to actually improve or edit or update portions of their documentary. This pre-production pathway that we're going to discuss right now will actually make that even more seamless and more organized and less chaotic for the teachers and the students during that process. So the first thing we're going to do is actually, by being able to be a good documentary filmmaker as a student, watching good documentary films also made by kids is a great place to start. So we'll talk about practices for making a great documentary. We're also going to talk about once they've done their primary and secondary research, which depending on the topic they have can be quite large. We're also going to organize and summarize research. How do we organize and actually summarize that research for a good documentary at the end? We're also going to discuss how to organize that research into an effective shot list, which is essentially organizing yourself once you go into filming the documentary. And also, we're going to talk about best practices around interviews, best ways to conduct interviews, tips for different styles of interviews, in addition to how to get your students thinking about really great questions to ask their interview subjects. Before we get started, I'm going to just tell you a little bit about the Film Center if you don't know much about us. We've been around for over 20 years, and our ed media education programs, they bring arts education into the classroom. We really are in service to teachers and students, and really our focus is that we believe good film makes better humans. And so we truly believe in the mission that a good quality film and robust discussion around those films can actually have transformational power in the classroom. The things that we provide in the community, and all four of these are at absolutely no cost to teachers and students, is we curate annually short and long subject documentary films that also have accompanying study guides. We host a Tumbleweeds Film Festival, which offers field trip opportunities for schools to be able to go to a kids-based film festival and be able to engage with filmmakers. We also do in-class workshops, which are in person and virtual, depending on what your rules and comfort level is in your classroom. And these are around topics of animation, screenwriting, acting for the camera, as well as teaching kids how to build media literacy skills while watching films. And as I mentioned before, we've been offering a teacher professional development program that creates media arts endorsements, ed tech endorsements, in addition to relicensure hours and USBE credits. And we've been completing that since 2015. little FYI plug, all of these are available if you want to expand these into your classroom by visiting utahfilmcenter.org/education. We still have plenty of opportunities to bring in-class workshops into your classroom, and we still have openings if you'd like to sign up for an in-person or our self-paced online competency-based teacher professional development program. And I'm also happy to answer any questions that you have at the end of this particular session. So with that being said, let's dive right in. So as you know, with the Utah History Day project, your students are asked to engage in very meaningful and thoughtful research and then compile that research into a documentary. Now, the feedback that I've received from Wendy, but I'd also like to solicit some from you, Brian, as well as you, Carly, as well as anyone else who's in the room. The biggest thing that we're coming in to do is really help fill gaps on areas that year over year, teachers have said they wanted more support for their students. The first one is making sure that the students are entering quality work into the competition. This means that they are not only meeting all the guidelines for Utah History Day, but also they are building a very impactful documentary that has the qualities that we look for in good film, which we'll unpack in a moment. We also see that students have a lot of difficulty going, okay, I've done all this research, but how do I organize it into a logical documentary with a beginning and a middle and an end? And where do I even start when I've just got all this research and all of these images and all of these clips from archive.org? What do I do with all of this? The other part is that there's always been a desire to infuse more interviews into these documentaries, because as we know, firsthand narratives can really create very effective and emotionally impactful testimony to a historical event or a place and time. And so we're actually going to unpack all of those different areas. Brian, Carly, anyone else in the room, are there other things that you have identified that your students or you as a teacher need in terms of support to help your students through the Utah History Day project?
I think my biggest, hi, I'm Lisa, is just what program should they use when they start putting their film together? Because like we've used, I think we were using some Adobe products that we have access to, but then we found some limitations where maybe we just need to go with Premiere Pro. I mean, just jump into that one. They have made it a little easier. But it was, at one point it was like, whoa, that's kind of hard for kids who've never done this. But some of them, they want to do it on their phone. They want to just, and then it's just not, they can't edit it or they can't. Yeah. So it was that's kind of where I get stuck, is with the program.
That was my thought as well. And I've had students use different types of programs. And I do feel like sometimes, depending on which program they do use, it does reflect in their project. And what like if they're willing to pay extra for a program that allows for more like technical things, I guess.
Absolutely.
But yeah, so I'm piggybacking off of that same question.
Absolutely. And those are really, really helpful things to know. And I think those are things that we hear all the time from teachers that aren't even doing Utah History Day, but also putting their students maybe through other types of programs. It's always that, what is the best tool to have the most effective product? And those are things that we're definitely in session 2 going to get a really nitty gritty into and talk about based on, and also it's the type of computers or the type of technology your kids or your classroom may have access to as well. So what we've been also doing to that effect is curating based on the type of technology you're using, whether it's an iPad, an iPhone, a Chromebook, you're using the computer lab there in your with a PC or a Mac at your school. Based on the technology that you're using, what's the best program to have the best outcome? And we're actually going to talk about a lot of ones that are, some of them are web-based and free, that actually get a very effective outcome without the investment of going out and buying Premiere Pro, because Premiere Pro is, unless you are a filmmaker, can be quite a lot of buttons. It can be overwhelming. We'll also talk a little bit about the enhancements that Adobe has done to some of what I would call their light versions of editing software like Adobe Rush, that has allowed students to be able to have a little bit more accessibility to quality editing tools, in addition to having the ability to actually work through that particular program at no cost. So we definitely will go over some of those technical aspects in session 2, which is all about equipment, gear, technology, just like the filmmaking nitty-gritty 101. So it's definitely a very heavy portion of session 2. Anything else that you have as identified pain points that you've seen over time as you've been helping your students participate in this competition?
Personally, I think they never work hard enough on their storyboard. I think they've got to lay it out first. They want to just jump in and start throwing pictures in there before they even have their story written.
Yes, it's
And
just
so
yeah, it's just picture,
Yes.
but it doesn't have a
There's a
logic.
piece of video. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, that kind of comes from the abundance of research, you know, especially if you're spending time on archive.org, if you're spending time on any of these resources that you can get an abundance of information and images, it can feel like more equals better. And we're actually going to talk a little bit with the documentary treatment, in addition to the shot list, how that can really help you summarize your work, but it'll also help you focus in like, what's my goal with the film in order to actually have an effective documentary with a clear beginning, middle, and an end. And that really helps you organize your information. So it's not just a dump of images and also B-roll and archive footage. Any other things?
Yeah, I do feel like with some of my students, depending on their topic, they've had a difficult time. Like they have the content, I guess, in the script, but as far as finding visuals that, like finding enough visuals that they're not looking at the same picture for 30 seconds, you know, that they're finding enough visuals, whether it's images or footage or interviews. So if there's any like more ideas of how to include more visuals, I guess, or different types of visuals that would allow for more variety, maybe, or just quantity, I guess, more, you know, more quantity, I guess. So, and that does, I know that does vary on topic. Like someone who's going to do an ancient civilization is going to have a harder time finding visuals and footage, right? Versus someone choosing a more modern topic.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you know, that also will gauge, can they do an interview as well for, which is other visuals for their subject area. And I know that that's something that has, you know, is something that's always an eternal question. Wendy, I know I read through the guidelines, but can you remind me, is there any limitations to students doing any kind of B-roll footage that might help visually, like, or metaphorically describe what they're talking about at that point in time, that doesn't necessarily have to be like that Ken Burns method of an image that they're focusing on? So let me give you an example, Wendy. So we may have them talking about an ancient civilization that lived primarily in the woods, and that they would shoot B-roll as they're describing that, maybe like actually a footage of people walking through the woods. Is that too reenactment-esque? I just want to double check.
That's a great question. There is not a rule prohibiting kids from shooting B-roll of their own.
Okay.
And there's also not technically, I'll have to look again, but I read through the rules again. There is technically not a rule against reenactments. However, this is very strongly discouraged.
Yes.
Because what kids will do is it will become a performance.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I remember that part of the reenactment being discouraged. So that's super, super helpful. Yeah. And we can actually talk about how we can draw that line between having really quality footage that is B-roll, but doesn't veer into that reenactment zone, because then it starts to become a hybrid of the theatrical competition portion of Utah History Day, in addition to the documentary. Okay, thank you for that clarifying point. So to answer your question, Carly, yes, there are actually lots of ways that they can capture images. And actually in our session 2, which does unpack a little bit of finding those particular materials, we will go into some of the best practice places to find that information, but also how they can do some effective B-roll that can actually help communicate some of their ideas as well.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, if there already aren't any additional questions, I'd like to kind of dive right into our first topic. The way that we organize this is through really guiding through lesson plans. And so when I say guiding through lesson plans, what I mean by that is actually walking you through, this is an activity that you can do with your student to get X outcome. So this is essentially how we're going to walk through this particular work. This very much mirrors how we do our teacher professional development, for your information, because we find that this kind of walking it through through the eyes of your students can be really, really helpful. And typically we tend to see that this also helps you be able to do a particular structure that is set up to where it kind of almost forces your students, before they check out a camera from you, before they do any filming, that they have to meet certain milestones before they get to the point of maybe hitting production. So that's a big thing that we're going to emphasize today. So the first thing that we're going to do is really look at how do we get students getting into the mindset of recognizing quality documentary work. So the first thing that we really encourage as the first anchoring lesson plan is actually working with your students prior to them formalizing what their topic is, prior to them formalizing, what research area they're going to cover, or social issue or event or individual for the Utah History Day project, is to really have them watch a lot of short subject documentaries to get them in the mindset of seeing what quality work can look like. So how this lesson plan works out is that, and by the way, any kind of materials that I reference, I will also be made available to you at the end of this presentation. So those of you who are watching later on, those of you that are watching live, if I pull up a worksheet or a handout or any of these examples, we're actually going to give you a fully scaffolded out lesson plan that has all the worksheets that we describe, all of the handouts, and all of the different links to the tools and resources that we're going to have available for you. So I'm going to just bop out of this for a moment and go into the idea of looking at quality work before they start making their own quality work. What we tend to see is that if they have the ability to recognize qualities of a good documentary film, then it has a higher probability they'll be able to replicate it on their own. What we have for this particular structure is I highly encourage you to find a really effective film from the Utah State History website on YouTube. In addition to that, I'm also going to send you a link to Utah. We have also a pretty robust collection of documentary films that students have made over the years through our programs of teacher professional development here at the Film Center. And we have them scaffolded grades 4 through 6, and then 7 on up to high school. So I'll also be able to share that with you as well. But how this lesson would work is that you as the teacher, to get your students in that mindset of kind of seeing kind of like where's the place they need to aspire to, is going through this lesson plan of the quality documentary. So what we have is an actual worksheet, and I'm going to make it just slightly bigger so you can see it a little bit. How does that look for everybody? Looks pretty good. Okay, I see some shaking of heads. So what makes a good documentary movie? This is actually something that really gets them reviewing and analyzing content that they are actually viewing. And then it helps them be a little bit more of a conscious media consumer, but also a conscious media creator. So one of the things that seems obvious is that they need to be very clear about what they're documenting in the actual documentary. Is it an event, a social issue, a community, a place, or a person? Quite often, if it's a person that is enveloped in events, for example, or a historical figure enveloped in social and cultural issues, sometimes not really narrowing like where's my focus on the topic. Is it the person or the events that the person went through? That really putting a finite point on that will really begin the process very clearly. This is the part where, as I think Carly had mentioned and others had addressed, is that quite often the student will go, okay, I'm researching about the Paiute tribe in Utah, and I'm going to start my research, and they start finding all of these images. And the most logical thing typically is to put it in sequential order on a timeline. However, one way that can really help the viewer of the film go through a journey, because really nonfiction documentary film and fiction documentary film follow the same what we call a 3-act structure. Getting your students thinking about how the beginning act of their film, which if it's a 10-minute film, the first 2 to 3-ish minutes should really be introducing the setting and the main characters or person or event that they are describing. Act 2, they start talking about maybe the social issues or the problem or the challenges that individual faced, or the challenges that happened during a very specific and concentrated historical event, or a challenge or a problem that a community or a person faced during this time in history. What was the source of that problem? What were the conflict that they dealt with? Where did the conflict maybe reach its most challenging places? And then how did they actually overcome those challenges? That really then starts to show kind of the end point of Act 3, which is the resolution, the conclusion, what happened after this event, what happened as a result of the social or cultural issue or uprising or community, that what is sort of their longevity after the event. Now, another thing that we tend to see is what we call in film the hook. We tend to see that the hook happens very closely aligned to about the climax of the film, where we see that we want to have a little bit of it at the beginning to catch the audience's attention, and we'll talk about some different techniques around that. But also we want to hook them back in when we really get to the kind of the climax, the crux, where like the real where really kind of all of the events come to a head. We also want to ensure that we are using obviously credible resources and a variety of resources. I know Wendy goes into great detail about primary and secondary resources in her training, but also having a variety of resources can be very, very effective. One thing that we tend to see in terms of just visual psychology with students is that we tend to need variety as viewers in order to have a more engaged and effective method of paying attention. So not just solely relying on a bunch of images that we're doing the Ken Burns effect, where we zoom into them and wipe them and move them out, but also are we using stock archival footage, if it can exist, obviously, with the advent of the invention of the film based on that event. How are we using maybe B-roll, which we'll talk a little bit about what that is in more detail. Are we using a combination of interviews, and are we structuring them in a way that not only shows that we have done our due diligence with research, but we have a variety of what we're visually seeing to keep our audience engaged. We're also going to talk about the effective use of interviews. Now, if the ability to have a subject for more that has lived through that event, or the actual person themselves that we are detailing can be interviewed, this sometimes firsthand personal narrative of the event can sometimes be some of the most emotionally compelling part of the documentary, which, if that is available, can be very, very helpful. The other big thing is pacing. Pacing is tied very much to what I mentioned earlier about the variety of subject areas. But in addition to that, also making sure that there aren't any slow points, that this can actually be effectively used by how we do editing and transitions and music, which we're going to get into a lot of detail with in our second session. Also, we have to think about the fact that a film is a visual story. It's visual storytelling. It's not just the narration of the child or the student that is narrating the individual information, but it's also how is that narration in combination with the way that they narrate, the tone of their voice, the interviews and the quality answers that they get from that, the use of music, sound effects, titles, credits, photographs, all of this in concert with one another being orchestrated very effectively for a good film. So what I'm going to show you at this particular time is the worksheet that your students can actually use as they are unpacking this. The recommendation for this lesson plan is to go over everything that I just described very much as I did with you. Discuss what that means, discuss and unpack what these different qualities of a good documentary film is, and then have your students actually watch one, either that was submitted from Utah History Day or one that you find particularly effective. Here are some of the questions that you'll want them to have. It's really having them analyze and figure out where are all of these different qualities of a good documentary, where are they seeing it happening? typically what I tend to see is that if a student struggles to find or the entire class is struggling to find an answer to one of these, that maybe that is an area of the film that didn't quite have a lot of effectiveness in that particular area. Maybe it didn't have a strong hook, or maybe it didn't really talk about like the issues that were happening and how were they resolved for this individual or this particular social group. Was there anything missing in that? So it also could be a great question on identifying what was quality work and where might there be some areas of improvement. What I'm going to do at this particular time is drop this particular worksheet into the chat of our lesson, so you can follow along. And we're going to just do this in practice and kind of generate some discussion. I've selected a film from the Utah History Day project. I'm going to also test for sound. So can you do thumbs up if you can hear it?
Clear communication is the key to understanding.
Perfect.
There's an old adage.
I always do that before we get started because quite often you'll get where it's like, I can't hear it. So we're going to actually, this is actually a submission from this. And as we've talked about these different qualities, as you're watching this, see if you can answer the questions that were provided on this worksheet. Also notice where you can't answer it, and that can be a really great discussion as well with your students. So we'll take this time to review this particular documentary film.
That there are two sides to every story. So what happens when written history and collective memory favor just one side? Throughout American history, there is a repeated pattern of inaccurate or incomplete communication of the Native American experience. Miscommunication of the Native American perspective has resulted in systemic misunderstanding, with far-reaching consequences. For most Americans, the Pilgrims' experience at Plymouth is synonymous with the story of the first Thanksgiving. But the Thanksgiving narrative most Americans are familiar with minimizes the perspective and proactive role of the Wampanoag people. With his tribe weakened from disease and seeing that the Pilgrims intended to stay, Chief Massasoit sought an alliance with the Separatists for defense against other area tribes. The now famous Thanksgiving feast occurred not because the tribe was extended a dinner party invitation, as many believe, but because the Wampanoag heard gunshots coming from the Pilgrim settlement. Honoring their agreement and assuming their allies were in danger, the Wampanoag hurried to help. At the settlement, they discovered that the gunfire was purely celebratory, and they joined in the harvest festivities. The first written account occurred when Edward Winslow, he was a Mayflower passenger, and he wrote a private letter to a friend in England. He says, "Our harvest being gotten in, our governor sent 4 men on fowling, so that we might, after a more special manner, rejoice together." The fragmentary record of this event permitted Americans' imagination to fill in the details. The 1621 harvest feast wasn't dubbed the first Thanksgiving until 1840. 220 years after the fact. Sarah Josepha Hale, a Mayflower descendant and journalist, starts telling stories about Thanksgiving, and she wants it to become a sort of nationwide holiday. And it's at a time in our history when these early generations of Americans were saying, we need to tell stories about who we are. This is what it means to be American. After Hale lobbied 5 presidents, Thanksgiving finally became an official holiday under Abraham Lincoln.
It's really designed to create this holiday that rejoins the country together in the middle of the Civil War.
While these early retellings do not appear to have been malicious in their omissions, their incomplete portrayals nonetheless robbed the Wampanoag and later Americans from a complete understanding of the tribe's loyalty as an ally.
As a nation, we've forgotten in our storytelling or chosen not to tell the stories of Indigenous people.
This pattern of miscommunicating events involving Native Americans continued. Andrew Jackson deliberately misrepresented Native Americans and their experience in order to further his political agenda, ultimately legalizing the acquisition of Native American lands and normalizing racism towards Native people. In Jackson's first inaugural address in 1829, he stated his intention to observe toward the Indian tribes that humane and considerate attention to their rights, which is consistent with the habits of our government. Yet these statements contradict his actions. Just 14 months later, after pressuring Congress, President Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act. This legislation authorized the president to purchase Native Americans desirable, cultivated land located within states' boundaries and to grant them unsettled federal land west of the Mississippi instead. Jackson illegally threatened, bribed, and coerced tribes into signing removal treaties.
The law required that they negotiate, but Andrew Jackson ignored that part of the law and The Cherokee, for example, were removed forcibly.
By 1837, Jackson's government succeeded in relocating 50,000 Native Americans, and at least 25 million acres of rich land became available to white settlers. 16,000 Cherokees were forced to walk the 1,200 miles, later known as the Trail of Tears, to Indian Territory. Despite 4,000 Cherokees dying due to assault, murder, weather, disease, and hunger, Jackson misrepresented these events, proclaiming, "It gives me pleasure to announce to Congress that the benevolent policy of the government in relation to the removal of the Indians beyond the white settlements is approaching to a happy consummation." Recognizing that removal of the Native Americans would incalculably strengthen the southwestern frontier, prime cotton land, and would enable those states to advance rapidly in population, wealth, and power, Jackson disseminated the idea that Native Americans were savages with
neither the intelligence, the industry, the moral habits, nor the desire of improvement, which are essential to any favorable change in their condition. They must necessarily bear long disappearance.
They framed it as a win-win for everybody.
Jackson's miscommunication of the process of Indian removal and the racist rhetoric he used to defend his policies had a lasting impact on the attitudes and behavior of westward migrants in the succeeding decades. As settlers rapidly moved west, calling it their manifest destiny in 1845, they eagerly applied the view Jackson had promoted of Native Americans as an expendable, inferior race in order to justify their takeover of native lands, as demonstrated by a government report in 1852. Destiny had awarded California to the Americans to develop, and if the Indians interfered with progress, they should be pushed aside. Settlers continued the pattern of miscommunicating about Native Americans for their own gain. Written records of the Bear River Massacre likewise favored a biased telling of events and omitted the Native American perspective.
It's the largest massacre of Native Americans in the history of the United States that nobody knows about.
In 1862, Colonel Patrick Connor and his Union troops, stationed at Fort Douglas in the Utah Territory, had the duty to protect the mail route from Native American attack and to keep an eye on Mormon settlers, whom mainstream Americans distrusted.
Connor was known to be itching for a fight. They wanted the glory of fighting in the Civil War, and instead they get posted in Utah.
Limited natural resources had led to pressure between Mormon settlers and local natives. Colonel Connor took complaints from the settlers as an excuse to initiate armed conflict. He led his men toward the Shoshone encampment and arrived near dawn on January 29, 1863.
They attacked the whole village, women, children, elderly, warriors, everyone.
The Shoshone took up arms in self-defense.
But the Native Americans quickly ran out of ammunition, and the troops just kept firing.
After about 4 hours, more than 400 Shoshone were massacred.
Colonel Connor and his men returned with reports of their heroism, prompting Connor's promotion to brigadier general. Journalists, over 100 miles away from the site, had no opportunity to investigate the Shoshone side of the story. A Salt Lake paper published, "From every statement that we have heard from those who were in the field, we conclude that the volunteers must have met the Indians with a bravery seldom equaled by regulars." An incomplete account of the event persisted for the next 150 years. The 1930 and 1986 memorials to Colonel Connor, the 1932 plaque celebrating the militiamen, and its 1953 edition recognizing the pioneer women who tended to the wounded all failed to communicate the Shoshone perspective.
It was called the Battle of Bear River, even though the Army attacks a sleeping village.
The Shoshone who survived the attack communicated the details of their experience to their children. May Timbimbu Perry's grandfather survived the massacre by playing dead. She spent years lobbying to correct the historical record. Finally,
the National Park Service changed the name from the Battle of Bear River to the Bear River Massacre.
Just recently, a new plaque on the Bear River Massacre Memorial was unveiled, finally illuminating the Native American side of the story.
This is where tribal people have actually been working proactively, pushing to change, to make the interpretation inclusive, to tell the whole story.
The reporting of the final armed engagement between the U.S. government and Native Americans in 1890 repeated many of the same elements of miscommunication apparent in the massacre at Bear River. The Lakota tribe was forced to hunt on 20% of their original reservation, with buffalo herds depleted by settlers. With promised food rations cut by Congress the year before and suffering harsh winter and drought conditions, they were starving. When news spread of a vision by a Paiute prophet that if the Plains Indians would peacefully perform the ritual ghost dance, then the white invaders would disappear and
we could reclaim our ways of life, the buffalo would come back, and we would be reunited with our lost loved ones.
The Lakota embraced the ghost dance religious movement. Concerned that the ghost dancers were actually preparing for war, U.S. officials decided to take some of the chiefs into custody and disarm and relocate the troublemakers. The largest deployment of federal troops since the Civil War was dispatched to end the ghost dance movement. When Colonel James Forsyth and the 7th Cavalry reached the Lakota camp near Wounded Knee Creek, Chief Bigfoot offered to surrender without resistance. On December 29th, the military surrounded the tribe's encampment and began to confiscate the tribe's weapons. When a deaf man misunderstood and didn't give up his gun, he was strong-armed by soldiers and his weapon went off.
So when there was one gunshot, everybody started shooting.
With most of their weapons confiscated, the Lakota were slaughtered. Worse, the soldiers targeted teepees of women and children, and those who fled were hunted for miles and murdered. 300 Lakota were massacred, half of which were women and children. Many of the 25 U.S. soldiers who died were actually killed by friendly fire. Initially presented as a battle, local settlers were relieved that the presumed uprising had been stopped. 20 Congressional Medals of Honor were awarded to the soldiers, and Colonel Forsyth was promoted to Major General. At the site,
there's a big sign up there, and it used to say Wounded Knee Battlefield.
But surviving eyewitnesses worked to correct the record. In 1912, some newspapers began calling the battle a massacre, but it wasn't until the 1990s that a memorial to the Lakota was included at the National Historic Landmark. Trying to understand history knowing only one side of the story is like trying to see with one eye closed, no depth perception. Communication of the Native American perspective is vital for real understanding of the people and history of the United States.
Right. I am always eternally impressed by that video. Thought you would stop. I'm always eternally impressed by the quality work that students in the state of Utah provide through documentary film. So let's go back and look at this. We're kind of modeling how we would do this in the classroom. Let's kind of model what that discussion may look like. So we're getting our students to think about what is a quality documentary. And so if we're the class, if we're the classroom, and I'll just be the role of the teacher. Obviously, you know, there's this may not have, you know, 110% all of the qualities of a great documentary film. But if you want to come off mute, come off camera, let's start talking about this. Let's start unpacking what the strong qualities of a good documentary is in this particular film submitted by a student in past competitions. So, what is the topic? What is it documenting?
The lack of communicating the Native American perspective.
Yep, that's pretty much it. And it's like the Native American perspective has not been included in major events happening to Native Americans in American history. What would you say are the main settings and the main characters? And in this one, it probably isn't like main people, but maybe main groups that are presented very early in Act 1, early beginning of the film. Wendy, you can answer too if you'd like.
If I remember, wasn't it, did it start off with the Thanksgiving story?
Yeah, the Wampanoags, I think.
Yeah, it starts off with the Wampanoags. And, you know, if we wanted to boil it down even more, it would be Native American tribes in general, and the white Anglo settlers that came into the United States. These are kind of the main actors, the main individuals that are being outlined in this.
So can I ask you a question real quick?
Yes.
Like, I think, like you can kind of infer as you watch the whole thing, but I didn't feel like they actually stated the purpose of the film till like that very last part.
Mm-hmm.
So is that something that you would encourage them to do earlier? When I think about like writing a thesis for a paper, you would do that pretty early on.
Yeah.
Not to jump into criticism, but I just felt like, since we're talking about that, I felt like, you know, right from the beginning, I didn't really figure it out until I got into it.
Yeah.
It took more directly what the topic was.
No, I think that it's not necessary. I think I would really encourage that your students, if they're looking at this as guidelines for a really well-structured and effective documentary film, that also coming up with areas where they thought maybe it could have been more effective is definitely important, because exactly what Act 1 should do is establish the problem. It poses the question, what happens when the Native American experience is represented one-sided through history, but it doesn't posit really till the end, what's the effect of that? to Native American populations. And
So
then
I think they presented that idea, but they didn't come right out and say it. And I don't know, maybe you're supposed to kind of not do that, but I feel like you should.
yeah.
If I can hop in, I am gonna confirm, Brian, that you are thinking correctly about the placement of the thesis statement. And this is always so tricky because kids feel like if they state their argument at the beginning, they haven't put enough information in place to state it. But in documentaries and performances both that are script-based projects, it's really, they need to put that thesis statement within the first 2 minutes and then come back to it again and hit it again at the end. Because judges, anybody who's watching needs to be able to, they will use that as a signpost so that they know what's coming and what to look for. And then the kids need to come back and hit that argument again at the end of the script in their conclusion.
Yeah, because initially I kind of felt like, oh, this is about the Thanksgiving story and how it's, misconceptions and stuff. So I was a little off. As it went on, I kind of,
kept going.
It's a broader
Yeah.
story than what I originally thought.
You need some navigational aids. You need some signposts.
Absolutely. And I think that this is a great point, definitely sometimes using a film that might not unpack it as maybe as effectively as it could. This example that we used, it can be actually a really great teaching tool for your students to show, did you know what the thesis statement was of this, or what the main problem or the main conflict or that the filmmaker was attempting. And if they feel they can't really answer that till the end, if we think about, most films are in that 3-act structure of beginning, introducing the problem, introducing the topic, introducing the main individuals that this will be covering, and then really bringing it to the climax, which I would argue that the climax is that as we saw progressively over time, these battles were changed to massacres, that representation over time started to become more considerate of the Native American experience. That would probably be its big, climactic turning point, which I think is beautifully shown in the B-roll of the actual unveiling in early January of the new, I think it was the Battle of Bear Creek in here in Utah. And so that could actually be a really good teaching moment to show that, if you don't effectively set up what your main problem or conflict or thesis statement is at this particular time in the film, the effectiveness of everything that you bring after that can be a little bit more challenging. So with that being said, what would you say how this film tried to hook the audience? Where did you feel like, ooh, I'm paying attention in the film? Or conversely, where did you think the film had challenges with that?
Well, it was kind of long and I'm having a hard time remembering, but I think the hook was the Thanksgiving story, right? Is that what they started with?
Yeah, it was kind of hooking in with the thing that we know the most commonly, like if
right. Most familiar, and kind of using that as the, we've kind of left some of the story out. So I think that was the story that was kind of the hook to their whole concept. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And also posing that question of, what happens when you only have a one-sided experience, and then using the most, probably the most easily recognizable, probably the first Native American experience with Anglo settlers that we learn in elementary school as the template to hook us in and to show, even with that one that we learned, I remember as little as kindergarten doing a little reenactment of a Pilgrim play, that's something that we are introduced to first as far as the Native American experience in traditional education. How would you say that the film concluded, how they actually, I think we'd argued that maybe they had this a little bit too latent in the film, but what would you identify as the main problem or conflict? And where do you think it reached the most climactic point in this documentary?
And to be fair, maybe they had it, I just had forgotten where, I don't remember if they had something after the Thanksgiving story or not that kind of suggested that. Maybe I just have forgotten it, but anyway.
It seems to me that they're using examples through time. And so there's not really a middle, but it's like, here is some evidence that supports our argument about misrepresentation. And the evidence comes from not just, showing you that the Thanksgiving story was created as a myth and isn't representative at all, but we also talk about Andrew Jackson and Indian removal. We also talk about the Bear River Massacre. We also talk about, what's the third one that they talk about? I think they had 3 cases of
wounded knee and
wounded knee, right? So they have 3. I'm going to say that the Thanksgiving story is a myth, right? And then they have 3 historical cases of injustice that become the evidence for their point about, in each of these cases, Native perspectives were either misunderstood or misrepresented.
That's really where they kind of build into the middle and kind of build the main argument in the film.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because not every project does this, but they did. A lot of kids will focus on one event, and then that really does give you that nice climax model where they, in the middle, there is a climax. I think in this, because they constructed it that way through case studies, it's sort of like there's not a peak, there is just a plateau at the top.
Well, I almost feel like the climax is kind of where, I'm trying to think, what's the question, Wendy, help me out, where like you talk about the effects of what?
Oh, like the significance?
Yeah, significance. It's almost like they're tying that part in, the significance of it. And I feel like that's kind of the climax. Like after these decades and 100 years of injustice, the climax is the significance. We've changed it now, right? That's kind of feels like the climax to me a little bit, but
maybe it is that shift to where people start using different language to talk about these histories.
Absolutely. And that's really kind of how that it reaches the most climatic point, but that's really what the resolution of that challenge was that was posited early on, which really ties it up into the last act of this. I feel that this would probably be, number 6 would probably be very easy for your students to unpack, because there was a lot of research that was done. It was thorough. And this one actually has a pretty has quite a bit of a smattering of interviews that are through this. And I was actually very surprised at the film quality of them, considering that it looks like most of them were done, all of them were done over Zoom. And that you can talk a little bit about with your students about how this helps enhance the story. As you heard from these individuals, what were some of the biggest things that you felt the interview did to help tell the story, or the collection of interviews that were used to help tell the story? Was it effective? Did it take away from the story? Did it help humanize it? What are your thoughts?
As I was listening to it, I thought it was kind of interesting. And I think this was just a certain style that they used. I don't necessarily think it was my favorite style, but how they would shift, they would be talking and then have like how they, the segments of the interview kind of finished their sentence, or like, does that make sense? Like completed their sentence. And I guess that's just a style, I guess, they used. And for me, it was a little distracting. But maybe others like the flow of that. I'm not sure. And I guess that doesn't really talk about content of interviews, but that's just something I noticed with interviews.
Yeah, it's very
You're
much
talking about how it panned to like they're kind of like their last phrase is almost like a little written out on the frame. Is that what you're talking about?
No, like
it almost kind of like highlighted their main point. But
the student would be talking, and then like they would be explaining something, and as they basically like where you would put a quote from somebody like on a paper, that's where the interviewer would start talking. And so it was like in the same sentence, like they just like finished their sentence. I don't know. I just found it kind of interesting.
And sometimes you could almost like not tell the difference between the voices, so you weren't sure.
Yes, or like that's a distraction for me, because I was like, wait, is that the same person still talking? Is there another student talking? And yeah.
And that's a really great observation about just interview styles, which we're going to unpack here in the latter part of this training, is that it is a technique, it is a style. The question that you would want to ask your students is it effective for the topic at hand? Does it add to the understanding, or does it take away from it? And for this one, it was kind of, it sounds like for you, Carly, it was like, wait a minute, who's talking? And then it kind of pulls you out of the information that, and the effect of the interview. It sounds like a lot of that, from what I could tell from the ones that were used, you know, they did a great placement of titles, and it looks like it's a lot of people that are subject matter experts.
I was gonna say it lends credibility just because of that.
Absolutely. And, you know, this one is definitely more of the style of lending credibility rather than this is my first person experience of this.
Right. In fact, before this project went to nationals, and when they met with our mentors, there is a real difference between using primary source interviews and then using like university expert interviews.
Mm-hmm.
And we're really discouraging kids from using expert interviews. I think using native voices in a project like this is really important, really important. And they did a lot of that, but they actually went back and took a lot of the interview footage out because there's so much of it that the students' own analysis kind of gets lost in this version. And so, you know, I think it's wonderful when they can pull clips from, you know, Darren Perry and other Native leaders who can talk about the impact of these things on their own communities and those histories.
Yeah.
It's something else entirely when they talk to a professor at a university because they don't have that tie. So it's something to think about, because I think with documentaries, these kids kind of fell into a little bit of that trap that we're trying to get kids out of with the student voice idea, which is, I've done so much research, I'm going to put it all in my project so you can see this is the equivalent of too many quotes in an exhibit or a website, right?
I almost feel like
oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
I almost felt like it, I agree. And I feel like it started to affect the pace of it. Like it was trying to cram way too much in. And you almost didn't have time to read the really good, you know, titles of who this person was because it was so fast.
Yeah.
And you're right. I think they could have just made the point themselves as the student and not have to necessarily worry about pulling in that professional opinion there. But I agree.
Yeah. And I remember last year going to one of the National History Day PDs that you did, Wendy, and that really stuck out to me, this idea of, you know, we don't want them creating, we want them to be the historians. We want them to have an argument with claims that are supported by primary sources and, you know, and some really valuable secondary sources, but it's really about their voice and representing that argument that they're making and not just submitting a history report.
Yeah,
absolutely. And, you know, one thing that I have found to be very effective, because, you know, we also teach this a lot when we're teaching the documentary, is really posing to your students as you're going through this lesson plan to help them have the same discussion that we're having right now, is how would your impact or how would your thinking be changed if you heard Native voices describing how this happened to their tribe, or this is the story my grandfather or my great grandmother told me about her experience of this event and what that felt like. That can be a really great discussion point to see what might have been the more effective use of an interview for the subject area. I feel like we've talked a bit about the story missing any details or information. So for the sake of time, that is something that you can discuss about what's missing if we feel as anything is missing. And also, let's talk a little bit about the pacing of the film. I think we've kind of alluded to this already. I think, Brian, you're like, boy, it's a lot crammed in there, right? So also looking at, and one thing that I see very much as a pattern with student filmmakers, especially when, I think, what was it, Wendy, that you said, or Carly, the recitation of a history report. Quite often what can happen in the recitation of the history report, and this is something that you can discuss, is there were, you know, and this is just kind of something that I observed, is that it felt like it all kind of followed the same pace and tone in the narration. And the question that you can ask is, what would happen if they would have paused, slowed down? If they would have lingered on an image?
Yeah, like take a breath once in a while.
Yeah. There's actually some really effective films that we're going to show that do this as an example, where the voiceover narration, by what you don't say, and when you don't say it, and when you linger over an image, how that actually can create a very strong emotional effect. But that reciting, it does also affect how viewers will metabolize the film, and will they start tuning out because it's all in that same tone or all that same pace. But actually slowing down the pace can, it's scary for kids because they want to get all that information in, but it can actually be much more effective to maybe slowing down when they ask the question, what happens when history tells a one-sided view of an experience?
Like, I'll give you an example. Like, the most powerful part for me was exactly what you're talking about when they zoomed in on the picture of Sitting Bull and
yes,
and
I think it was Custer, wasn't it?
no, it was Buffalo Bill.
Oh yes, okay, that was Buffalo Bill. Okay.
And they, like, they zoom in on the picture and then they cut Sitting Bull out of it and focus on Buffalo Bill, and I mean, that was pretty powerful to get the point across that we're eliminating half the story. That was the part where they kind of slowed down and used that visual image to drive that point home, and I think that was pretty powerful, rather than
I agree,
cramming through a whole bunch of photos. As many, just at times it felt like I have all these photos, I need to use them.
And one thing that I would really emphasize to your students is less is more, definitely in telling the story. And I agree with you, Brian. I had the same feeling when I was watching this. I went, ooh, I'm really emotionally processing what's happening here. And it should be an emotional experience, because film is an emotional journey that we go through, and whether it's fiction or nonfiction. So really taking those moments to unpack, had we had more moments like that, how might we have interpreted this film differently? Obviously, they use a lot of different visual storytelling techniques in this film. But one thing that I would encourage, if you use this or any other one in this, is that I think the variety was really good. They had some B-roll, which was, some of the Bear River footage, some of the footage out in, looked like out in the snow when they were discussing the Trail of Tears, which was, also during a very intense season of that year, and it was one of the most intense weather seasons of that year when that happened. That really going and looking at how that helped break things up. Obviously, it does heavily rely a little bit more on photographs and sketched images. And so really having your students talk about those different visual storytelling techniques, but also keep in mind that visual storytelling is also how they change from shot to shot, which the film did a good job of. Sometimes they would do the quadruple shots, they would do a fade out or a fade in or a slide across, that it wasn't always just the same type of shot. So this is something that I really encourage that you model the same discussion that we had with your students, because what it'll start having them do is, by seeing what the film does well, but also having a discussion of what is lacking, which you would probably guide a little bit, if the kids don't see that maybe go back and show them a little section, that this can really get them to start thinking about, how can I make my film as effective as possible on the parameters of a quality film. So the next thing that I really would like us to spend some time on is, how do we then take all this information that the students have and get it down into a nice, condensed, less is more effective documentary, and not cram all those shots and maps and pictures and interviews into that. What this does is, if the students can really start unpacking a couple of ideas around their documentary, this will help them do the more less is more technique. It'll help them pause for effect a lot more on areas that can really help us have an emotional impact. And also it can help them really kind of put their artistic vision on the film itself. So what we're going to go over right now in this particular time, and if you have any questions, feel free to plop them into the chat, or just come off mute. This is pretty casual, is we're going to start talking about how to build their artistic vision by using what we call documentary treatment. One thing I want to emphasize about how we teach at Utah Film Center is we use the same architecture that would be used in the industry. The reason we feel this is really important is that we believe not only that good film makes better humans, and by watching more film, we become a more compassionate, empathetic, and understanding world, but also we know that we are also in audience with someone who might be a future documentarian that comes out of Utah, or a future filmmaker, or a future historian that comes out of Utah. And so therefore we try to use the industry standard of actually how documentarians do their work. Obviously we distill it down to a little bit more simplistic, but we use the same language. So then should a student find that they're quite passionate about this and they want to continue on, that, you know, they go, oh yeah, treatment, I remember that when I was in Utah History Day. And then when they win their Oscar for Best Documentary, they can thank Wendy and Utah State History. So with that, let's talk a little bit about a treatment. So what the treatment does is it takes all of those qualities of a really good film and actually puts it on paper. It is almost like them writing an outline for their paper. It also helps them really get it into a very clear structure. So it eliminates that feeling of I'm just reading and reciting the paper that accompanies my submission for the actual event. So what a treatment does in the industry is that quite often the way that treatments are funded is that the funders of a documentary, they want to know what the topic is. They want to know especially the scope that this topic, which could go many different directions, is going to take, and how they are going to make use of archival footage, real life footage, as well as any other type of techniques that they're going to use, because that will help them determine, yes, this has been a well thought out film and I'm going to greenlight it and give you funding for it to happen. So what we're going to look at with the documentary treatment is I highly recommend that the way that you do this lesson is the following. Is actually taking the research and after the students have decided this is the topic that I want to cover, this is the scope that I want to do with this topic, is to start using this treatment to really start organizing their research and organizing it into a film that has an effective beginning, middle, and end. So let's look a little bit about what this is. So I'm just going to close out some of my documents and open up this other one. So what it has is guidelines, and I would highly recommend maybe using the same film again. We tend to find this really effective if students can use an example to fill out the worksheet and then fill out the worksheet on their own, maybe going back to the same film that you decided to screen, but have them actually answer these questions or outline it as if they were the filmmaker of this film about Native American representation. So one thing that they want to do is they really want to start thinking about what the title of their film will be. We quite often see that students will have maybe multiple examples or they don't know where to start. I encourage that you have your students come up with many titles and then really select one that they feel encapsulates the story the best and the film that they're going to work on. You want them to be able to summarize their film in a couple of sentences. Or one. We call it a long line in the industry. It really helps them say, what's this film about? It is the limited representation of the Native American experience in traditional American history. That's the log line. If it takes them a really, really, really long time to explain it, then this log line kind of forces them to really start boiling down what the main idea is. Also, this helps them give an overview of their story. They're going to also start summarizing the details, issues, the questions that they want the film to answer. We also want them to start thinking about what is my unique voice as the documentarian, the student documentarian that I'm going to bring to this, and how am I going to make this film that is kind of, my unique storytelling. And then who is my audience? Am I sharing this obviously for the adjudicators of Utah History Day documentary subject, but also is this to educate, to inform Utahns maybe about the Native American experience that they may not know about, or maybe they heard one side of it through their own cultural experiences in the state, and there's an entirely different story that's involved with that. So let me show you a little bit about what this treatment looks like. You do have also what they want to start thinking about is who's going to help them through this. Even though it is usually a very solitary task with this, they may want to consider other resources that may be needed in the production team. Will mom have to drive me down to, will mom drive me on a little field trip to Standing Rock if I'm going to do that particular topic? Who will be the people that will help me capture what I need? They also have multiple movie titles. And then what you want to do is taking that template of what makes a good story, really have them start thinking about that act one early in. They need to accomplish the establishment of the topic, the essential questions they're going to be asking, what that thesis statement is early on, like introducing it early on, and the main groups that will be involved. With Act 2, you want to make sure that they have at least introduced what the main problem is that they're solving, the conflict that they're unpacking, the main questions that they're having answered. But also they also need to think about how they're going to get it to its most effective climactic point, where they really then, bring all of the transition into a head. And this one, it really is, the climax is that through time, the representation of Native Americans started to be more prominent, but how are we building to that particular final resolution? And then Act 3 should really be tying up all of their main ideas, that they're writing out how this is going to look. Now, one thing that they want to be able to do is summarize the topic. One thing that we find with students, and I would wager that this film that we had, I feel like it covers quite a lot in a short amount of time. This can give the students the ability to really summarize the work and make sure that the work that they are doing around this topic is very, very clear, and also summarized. Less is more. So they're not just coming up with 10 or 15 events where the Native American experience was underrepresented, but maybe they're focusing very much on the first Native American experience, and maybe the Native American experience here in Utah, for example, or one historical event. Now, the other thing that you want to think about with the documentary treatment is the artistic approach. This is something that if you go back to writing a documentary treatment, what this is very much the unique voice of the student. How is the student going to tell this story? Are they going to focus more on first-person narratives of people who went through that experience? Are they going to focus much more on having the story put us on an emotional journey through historical events? What is the main questions that they want to do artistically? This really will help them build their voice as they're going through this process. They may want to maybe do very innovative capture of film, or they want to do a lot of B-roll that's like at the actual locations that they're talking about. Really having them start thinking about like kind of what's the main way they're going to communicate this story. That's really their artistic vision. That's their unique stamp. As we see the artistic approach, for example, of a documentarian like Ken Burns, he uses a lot of archival footage. That's kind of his jam. And he does interviews interspliced between it and archival footage. Other documentarians jam, so to speak. If we think about the documentarian, My Octopus Teacher, there's almost zero archival footage that's in there beyond some things that he did in the past before he got to the moment of actually going into the ocean in his home and interacting with that octopus. That's his particular vision, is the here and now. And so making those decisions early on as a student filmmaker will also help them figure out what they're going to use and what they're not going to use in the film as well. And I'm just checking the chat. I absolutely loved My Octopus Teacher. Me too. I watched it last week and I was blown away, and I will never eat octopus again because they are too smart. So yes, definitely. So this will really help your students kind of really focus in their story. Think of it very much as an outline. It also will help them organize what should happen first, second, and third, and the way that they're going to communicate this story. The intended audience piece, one thing that they really want to think about is they want to think about the people that would be watching this film. So for example, with the film we just watched, maybe the intended audience is an individual who went through the traditional route of education that focused very much on the Anglo experience through American history, which we would say probably anyone who's gone through the education system in the last 70 years, they would fall into that intended audience category. With that being said, they really want to think about, am I educating all Americans who went through that system? Is this more to focus on children who might be starting these subject areas of the Native Americans in America? Where's the intended audience? It'll really scope out at what level of depth, but also at what level of communication will the students have with the film. If there's any questions we have around the treatment, really what it is outlining their thoughts, really getting them honed down. But then you say, okay, with these summaries that I'm doing, how does this then translate into the research that I use to be able to make the film? This is really where we're going to start working on the idea of what's called a shot list. Now, what the shot list is planning how you're going to film. You still don't have the camera in hand at this point. And I don't know if we have anybody who's that little submitting to Utah History Day, probably not, but I think that picture's cute. But what you want to think about with the shot list is that this really helps your students figure out, what am I putting in and what am I taking out? One thing that also, if they use this particular shot list plan, it can really help them realize, like, whoa, I've got like 600 images that I have collected. I probably don't need that many for my beginning, middle, and end. So we'll talk a little bit about what the shot list looks like and what this lesson plan may be. What we recommend for this is that probably this happens, they've watched some film, they've seen the ideas of a really good quality film, they're able to understand what should be included, what should not be included, considerations they need to make by watching examples from their from classmates or previous competition entries. They're starting to kind of build that outline with the treatment that's like, okay, this is what my topic is, this is how I'm going to introduce the information, how I'm going to show how this information reaches a climax, how I'm going to resolve these issues. This is the kind of way that I want to film it, the style that I want to film it as an individual student, and giving them lots of different examples, maybe even screening some films, like, for example, films that you have access to that are documentaries, to see these different types of styles. And we'll give you some student-driven ones from Utah Film Center's archives as well. And then also figuring out what their intended audience is. Once that's the outline, now they've got to figure out the content that translates into the outline. And that's really what the shot list is all about. So what a shot list is, this is actually done very similar to storyboards. One thing that we tend to see in the documentary industry that helps students a lot is quite often with a traditional film, and if you've ever looked at storyboards versus the final product of a movie, you will see that there's quite often a lot of variance to it. Storyboards can be really, really effective, especially if the students want to have, they really struggle with how it should look overall. But one thing that we tend to see is that once kids start sitting down and filming, especially if they're going to use a combination of interview, archival footage, photographs, and maybe some B-roll of images, there's going to be a lot of unpredictability that can happen. And also with the shot list, you are also relying on the fact that you've captured quality footage. So one thing that we're going to be looking at with the shot list is kind of best practices on how to organize what to film first, second, and third, and also coupling that list of what you're going to do to have a much more effective set of filming. So one thing, I'm going to actually switch over here to documentary treatment, is the shot list. So the biggest thing that the students want to focus on is location, date, who they're filming, how are they establishing the story. And we're going to actually see some examples of this and the different types of shots that they're going to use. Now we're going to unpack the shot styles and the different, the role is probably, like, number 7 is probably not going to be really relevant if the kids are working all independently. They're pretty much their director, producer, cinematographer, and other in their own project. But what we will see with this is that one of the things that they really want to start thinking about is some of where this filming is going to happen. So the first thing that we want to think about is where the video or still images would be shot. And we'll talk a little bit about best practices for that. What we'll also talk about is the different type of shot styles. This will really help them build their specific voice. So what you see is that for each time they are going to do a different shot, and keep in mind this would be a different image, a different piece of archival footage, where it's a little bit of like footage roll. They may go out, for example, let's say that they're doing something about Parowan Gap down in Cedar City, and they go down there and actually film the petroglyphs and that gap and that event that happened between Native Americans and Mormon settlers, that they want to start listing out all the different places that they're going to do filming. Let's say they're also interviewing someone whose grandfather was there at that, great-grandfather was there at that event. What they want to start doing is looking at where their locations will be, who will be their interview subject, and also the different types of shots they're going to use. So for example, we are going to get more technical into these different types of shots, but the establishing shot is usually the first image that you see for that one subject. So let's say, for example, it's going to be an interview with Wendy about the history of Utah History Day. And maybe the beginning of our interview, our establishing shot is me and Wendy sitting in the Utah History Archives. And you see the two of us actually beginning the conversation, but then the next shot is just focusing on Wendy. Maybe the next shot is focusing on me, asking her the questions. Maybe the next shot is focusing on Wendy, where it'd be more of like an interview style. These are things that you want your students to start mapping out. And also you want them to start figuring this out, because then they want to organize where all these events are taking place. Now, different shot styles we'll go into in our next course, in our next subject, but we're going to come back to specifically these different shot lists. One thing that we encourage as your students are starting to organize this information is two things. One, do the interviews early, and regardless of the order of where it happens in the film, do it early and often if needed. So let me just check the chat really quick. I have to go to my second job, but I'm hoping Wendy will send us the links. Thanks, Julie. Oh, thank you so much, Brian. Maybe he'll go back and watch it and hear my thank yous. But one thing that we'll want to keep in mind is that quite often, and I'll show you some best practices to hopefully eliminate this here in a moment, but quite often you'll have your students make a plan to film. And let's say that they film, like the interview is in the second half of their actual filming. I actually encourage that you film in a cluster of types. What I mean is this: let's say that you have a cluster of B-roll images that you're going to be filming, or you're going to be capturing, most likely, since we don't really do that panning over a camera anymore, panning with the camera anymore over images. We can do a lot of that with our editing, which we'll go into in our next session. But we want them to be able to talk about, like, how am I actually going to capture this? So maybe location is in Adobe Spark, for example, where they're going to be moving the images, and they're going to actually have an early shot where it's much, much wider, and they're going to zoom in to maybe one particular subject in the photo. You want them to map all of that out very clearly in the shot list, and you want them to actually group those types of events. So ideally that, let's say the location is, is Carly's classroom, and they're using Adobe Spark for periods, period 2 for every time that they're with Carly for the rest of the next 2 weeks. That would be their location. And they're actually going to list every different shot would be every different type of image that they want to capture in the time that maybe, for example, they're using Adobe Spark. Shot styles would be the way that they're going to film it. Are they going to pan across it like this? Are they going to have it tilt up from the bottom and make it look really good? Are they going to, like I said, maybe zoom into one character? Or as we saw quite effectively in the last one, they're going to crop out the Native American and just focus on Buffalo Bill. Those are the things that they're going to start listing in this. And we recommend that they list it in groups. So anything that's going to be archival images, let's start listing them out under location. Maybe it's probably going to be more than 3. So they're going to come down and maybe add another where it's like, maybe if these are the Act 1 shots and these are the Act 2 shots on the next, as much as they need for that. We encourage also the locations for interviews are done early in the process. The reason for this is that although we may have that we may find that the interview should happen early on, because let's say you go back and watch the footage and the sound was off, or the lighting was terrible, even though you planned it out really, really well, or for some reason the footage just looks really grainy, or you had a really, really great moment and then a big garbage truck came past the location that you could not control. We recommend that early recording of interviews if interviews will happen, because then it also can do two things. It can solve any technical issues that your students are going to have, but also sometimes your students will start looking at the footage, and as they're starting to plan out the film itself, they're going to find that, oh, maybe I need to ask a follow-up question of Wendy about the origins of the Utah History Day event that happens in Utah schools, and they may want to do a subsequent filming. So we do recommend that the interviews are done early and often. We also recommend that any footage that's going to happen, what we say out in the field, meaning that let's say they're going to drive over to Standing Rock and they're going to film some footage there, or let's say they're going to drive down to Parowan Gap with their family and film some footage there. They may be very well intended that you want to do that, but let's say, for example, you drive down there and you were going to do that at 10 a.m. on a Saturday, and there's a massive tour bus that pulls up, which that happened last time I was at Parowan Gap, and hundreds of people got out. And I was like, oh, well, this made Parowan Gap very different for me taking photos of it. But if you were going to film that you want to be able to plan should things like inclement weather, unexpected happenings, or maybe the event is actually closed, even the location's actually closed, which happens sometimes with native parks or monuments or parks based on weather or any other kind of condition. So really having any of those things where there might be an element of uncontrollable factors, we recommend that you put those early in your list. Now, here's the other thing that you want to keep in mind is that you will be filming this likely out of sequence. This is okay. If your kids know that they have filmed it out of sequence, one thing that they can do to organize that, which we'll talk about in a minute, is actually organizing it into folders that are interview footage, captured still images, captured B-roll, captured archival footage. Actually organizing it that way will help them be able to also pull when they go into that editing based on feedback, which we'll talk about next time. It'll actually help them be a lot more organized through that process. So it's totally okay if it's out of order, because remember, the editing timeline is where we put everything in order anyway. So keep in mind that this particular shot list is really highly recommended, that it's grouped based on type, it's grouped based on location, and it's grouped based on different ways or locations that they may capture. Any questions about that? Because I know sometimes that can seem a little strange, and it's definitely going to make your students uncomfortable. They're like, what? I'm not filming it sequentially in order of like beginning, middle, and end. But actually this will make for a much more effective library of stuff that they have that they're using to build their film, which, our goal is that we want them to go into the next level of competition, and this will make their life so much easier if they actually have categorized it this way and shot it this way in one big group. Any questions that you have about that? None? All right. Well, the next thing we want to talk about is interviews. Oh boy, there's a lot with interviews. So one thing that the documentary shot list also helps the students unpack, it really gets them thinking about one thing that I love about the shot list, and I've actually used this on student projects that I've done in the past and also projects that I've done professionally in the past, is that they will also be able to see right away, oh, I've got way too many still images on my shot list. I've got 8 pages and half a page of maybe B-roll. The shot list will also help them see where they maybe have a disproportionate amount of different types of footage. And so that is something also that the shot list can be really, really helpful on, is actually taking this list. And let's say, for example, and I would recommend print out lots of pages. It's just 2 pages here, but this can be, the second page can be replicated over and over and over again for your kids as you're working with them. One thing I encourage is that after they've listed out every single image that they've collected, every single, bit of stuff that they're going to film, actually have them go through this and go, what would you take away? What would you trim? What do you see you have too much of and not enough of, to help create balance? The shot list also really, really helps with that, is to help them actually see on paper they've got 10 pages or 8 pages of still images and only maybe half a page of some B-roll, and they're filming about a subject area that's right here in their backyard. So maybe being able to capture some of that to create more balance would be helpful. So let's talk a bit about taking then, this shot list is essentially it's your checklist as you're going out into the field to film. But before you go out into the field to film your interviews, you really want to ensure that you get effective questions asked because then you're going to get some super awesome answers. And then also we want to make sure that the interview style truly matches the subject area, the subject that you are covering, and also your artistic vision as a student filmmaker. So this particular section, I would recommend that this is a separate lesson plan. So really, I would recommend these are 4 separate lesson plans. What makes a good documentary? How do we create a documentary treatment? How do we create, after we've done all our research, create a shot list and we've got all of our materials? And then how do we go out into the field? Which one of the first things we would encourage you to do is to do your interviews early. So with that, interviews can be done quite well if they're organized and prepared. I'm going to go over a couple of best practices that we use in the industry to ensure that we're getting really quality footage. It actually begins with a script. So for example, if you go to our Utah Film Center website, we actually started, we did over the summer, it was a collection of interviews. We did interviews with school teachers who have used our programs, with people that worked at the Film Center. Unfortunately, I'm in a lot of it too, and you see me in there, but all of that was done interview style, and then a combination of to describe who we are and what we do as the education department. The different type, the way that we did that is we actually built a script where we asked a lot of questions to be able to have an abundance of answers. And I would say out of all of the questions we asked the teachers, all the time of footage, if we did an hour of interviewing with the teacher, maybe about 2 minutes of it ended up in the entire series of films that we did. So you think, wow, that's a capture of a lot of information, but you want to have, the goal with interviews is to have too much footage rather than not enough footage. And one thing that you want to do in this is depending on what type of interview that you want to do. Now, this will also very much depend on the style of your film. So let's say, for example, so there's kind of 4 major ones that we have, or I'm sorry, 5 major ones that we have. We tend to see that kids feel much more comfortable, and there definitely is a lot more control variables about what we say is the formal interview. You want your kids to start thinking about what style matches their subject area the best, but also be able to be a little bit flexible should the day that they interview this does not work out, which, it's Murphy's Law when it comes to filming. Expect the unexpected when you're out in the field filming. The one that's the easiest to be able to really control the variables of the situation is a formal interview. This is the one where you really are only seeing the interview subject, the person who's actually being interviewed. I would say that this one is the subject area. This is very much the style that the one we watched actually did. What we see with this is that your interviewer will be off camera. The questions are asked in a way, and they're edited in a way where you're really only hearing the answers rather than the question posed. And also what we see with this is that we tend to want to have the subject of this very close up because we really want to focus on what the individual is saying, which, as we saw with the editing of these Zoom interviews, we really had a nice, good, what as we call a medium close up, where we're about torso up. This tends to be very effective for a formal interview. Now, the news magazine interview, I always joke this is the Barbara Walters interview because this is really the interview where you see the interview subject, you see the interviewer asking the question, and you see also the interviewer answering as well. So with that being said, this is one where the questions are being posed and also you're hearing the answer. And that's why I joke it's like the Barbara Walters interview, because we see Barbara and then we see her go over to her subject matter. Very much some great examples that you can have with this is almost all network news, almost all local news, 16 Minutes, 2020, all those different news journalistic programs pretty much follow this format. It's very, very common. Also, what you'll see is the journalistic one, where this one is a little bit more like broadcast news. These are ones that, for example, when I've done interviews, I've done the most, where you kind of have like a side by side of the interview. We tend to also see that the filmmaker has him or herself in the film as equally as they have the interview subjects in the film. This one works really effectively, specifically for if this person, the student, is actually personally impacted by the historical events. So let's say that they're talking about, for example, the subject of downwinders, and they grew up in that particular area, and they're talking about their own personal narrative of living as a downwinder in southern Utah. And they're also talking, and that's their historic subject area. This journalistic reporter approach can be very, very effective for that. The news magazine one can, and the formal one can be very, very effective when we're using older subject areas that, whereas the individual may be talking about an event that is maybe several generations removed or several decades or centuries removed. The action interview, these are the ones that, and also the street interviews, these are the ones that tend, and also the journalistic one, if you're on location while you're actually having your personal, you're in the film as well. These are the ones that you want if your kids really want to use them, really have them start thinking about the elements of capturing it effectively, which we'll talk about. Well, I'm going to show you a film here in a moment that really unpacks that with interview styles and different types of locations. But one thing you want to keep in mind with this interview style is that the elements will be a little bit harder to control. So if you are in action, so you see this a lot actually with 2020 interviews as well, in 60 Minutes, where they're sitting down talking to the interview subject, but maybe they're also walking and talking with the interview subject at the location where the event happened. For example, they might be interviewing a tribal leader at an actual tribal location of which their subject area is being covered, and they're walking and discussing it, and they're giving them a tour and having a conversation and asking them questions and receiving answers. Those are things that, things of, is it a windy day? Was the lighting bad? Did I not capture my sound? Was there a lot of background noise that I had to deal with, like crunching on gravel, stepping on crunchy grass, or, muddy roads? Those are things that we tend to see can be very, very challenging with the action shots. And also this is the same for the street interview. You probably will see less of this used, especially if we're doing historical research, but it can be used, for example, if you were to go up, and we see this quite a lot in comedy bits for our late night, where they do interviews about, do you know, can you name 4 Native American leaders in American history? Maybe they're going up to the common person and using that as an interview style, then to unpack about how we know very limited things about the Native American experience, because it's always been in the perspective of the Anglo experience in North America. So those are other different types of interviews that can be done. They can have a very effective approach. It can really help, and probably using one over the other and not a combination of them will create a little more symmetry in the film. But definitely have your kids start thinking about what type of interview will either A, have the best emotional effect, or B, convey the information in the most effective and powerful way in my film. What I'd like to show you is a couple of different types of interview styles, and also some strategies for effective interviews. These films were made by Utah Film Center last summer to really help students get some quick tips. And I highly encourage that when we provide this information for you, I think that Wendy will then put through the website that she detailed here earlier on, that you'll be able to see these different types of strategies and styles. So let's go a little bit into what interview styles and strategies are highly recommended for a really effective different type. And it's really, this also kind of boils it down, besides just talking about it like I did a moment ago, but also showing this and discussing it as you're working with your students can be really, really helpful. Thumbs up or I think everyone's off camera. So if you can't hear it, just come off camera. Come off of mute and say can't hear it. But I think it should work since the first one did.
In many documentary and instructional video projects, some of the most important content will be provided by interview subjects. This content is what drives your story forward. There are several different ways to set up interviews, depending on what you want to accomplish.
The formal interview setup is usually done in a studio or designated space where lighting, sound, and background activity can be controlled. The interviewee or subject can either be sitting or standing, and either facing the camera or looking slightly off screen to the interviewer. The camera is typically set up in a medium to medium close-up shot from about their navel to the top of their heads. Don't forget your rule of thirds and nose room for your interview subjects. Another quick tip is to have the camera and the off-camera interviewer be the same level as the subject's eyes. In the formal interview setup, we typically don't see nor hear the interviewer nor their questions.
In the magazine setup, it's very much like the formal, but you are giving equal importance and camera time to the interviewer and the interviewee. For this setup, you'll typically need at least 2 cameras, one for each person, and the ability to capture audio from both. In the street interview, the director or producer don't control the setup and simply ask questions to people in their natural environment. The camera is focused on the subject and the interviewer is not on camera.
For the reporter setup, the subject and interviewer are having a conversation where the camera is panning back and forth between the two, or filming both interviewer and subject, also called a two-shot.
Another way to acquire important content for your film is to capture people in reality, or verite, and have them talk as they perform a task in the moment. This method is very useful in bringing the audience into the subject's world of experience. Another important consideration in getting the content you need is how you ask questions. The key to a successful interview is getting your subject to talk honestly and with emotion about the topic of discussion. The best way to do this is to make the interview feel more like a conversation instead of a series of questions to be answered. Here are a few tips to help you be a better question asker.
Know the content and try to memorize your questions beforehand. Constantly referring back to your notes is jarring for the subject and will interrupt the flow of conversation.
While your subject is talking, be a good and attentive listener. Keep eye contact and make appropriate facial expressions to encourage them to keep sharing. This will also build trust between you and your subject, which is critical if they are going to share their emotions or personal stories.
And finally, don't forget to ask people how they feel about the topic and what they want or desire. Emotional responses are the best responses for documentary filmmaking.
All right. I'm really, really proud of this film series that we did, and we have so many more with these wonderful individuals that helped us get these together last summer. I think it's always going to be time-stamped a little with those masks on, but that's totally okay. But this is a great film to show your students, to get them to start thinking about, one, the type of interviews they want to conduct and which one might be most effective for the subject area and the interview subject and individual that they have. In addition to that, this will really help them have some basic tips. They're things that after they are described, like, oh, be in the same eye level as your interview subject. Look at them, make eye contact, nod your head, smile, respond to them, ask them how they feel about it. They seem so common sense, but as a young filmmaker, it may not be the type of interaction or communication they've yet to have. And so these can be some really, really great tips, not only for effective interviews, but it's so great for students to learn about effective interpersonal communication as well. So one thing that the interview styles can do, this can be a good accompaniment to it. This worksheet is really great to give the kids as they're starting to formalize kind of what their artistic style will be, what their shot list will look like. There's also some interview tips that we have as well. These are also ones that I think are so great for students to learn, just also how to be a little bit more organized and also to really up their professionalism as they're working with individuals out in the community or in the country when they're giving interviews. Having one thing that I think is super important that your students, if you don't already have it as a rule for the Utah History Day, is to do a subject release form. It's industry standard. It ensures that, everything's by the books. We will be providing a sample one for you, but essentially what a subject release form is just saying is that I consent for you to interview me, to ask me questions, and to actually film me for this subject area. This can be very, very effective for students to do, but it also is just best practice in general if they do other filmmaking in their future. So we do recommend that the students have this actually sent to the individual they're going to film well in advance so they can have it, sign it, and return it before they even sit down to interview. Last minute best practice would be that you bring it with you on site and make sure that it's signed before you turn on the camera and film anything. This is very, very effective. And it also is a very good cover your bases type of practice that is really great for any type of subsequent filmmaking that they use with real life subject areas. Also, really having, being very prepared, know about the person that you're interviewing, and then also, dressing appropriately, wear non-distracting attire, put your phone away, turn it off, all of these different things. And we'll talk a little bit about testing the placement of the camera for sound and quality. But also, the biggest thing that you want to do to conduct a good interview is have very good questions and phrase them for a thorough response. The biggest thing you want to avoid is having questions that give a yes or no response. It's not a whole lot you can do with that. So you want to ask very open-ended questions. So rather than, for example, a yes or no one would be, were you at Stonewall during the Stonewall riots? Yes, I was. Or a better question would be, tell me about your experience of the Stonewall riots. It's my understanding that you were there. How old were you? Tell me a bit about that day. All of a sudden, you're going to have tons of footage by just making that question a little bit more open-ended and being able to avoid that yes or no. It's going to give you a rich abundance of answers and probably more information than you actually need. The other thing that you want to do is definitely not speak over the interview subject, to really take your time. Let the subject take their time as well, because sometimes, especially when we're recalling information that happened some time ago or was communicated to us, through maybe oral history some time ago, it does give us some time to remember. And what we may also see, and this is so common, I've seen this so often in interviews, where as they start to talk about it, more memories start to come forward. And then it starts to tumble out even more information. So really giving them time to answer the questions and to pause for a really, really long time between the next question will give you the ability to not only have footage that's nice and clean and probably also has a little dead time between the front and the end of it. It can sometimes give the subject that you're interviewing a lot of really effective time to think and process as they're working through it. I'm not going to go through each one of these, but I highly recommend that you go through this. I think you'll find that a lot of this has a great interconnection between best practices, but also just professionalism and effective interpersonal communication. The interviewing techniques, this really kind of helps us get out of that yes or no, is really have your students sit down and build questions, write the questions beforehand. I would recommend that as the teacher, you're essentially the executive producer of this film. That means you're signing off on the students going from one step to the next. And so what I would recommend is to go through what we would call executive producing clearance. What this means is that if you follow these lesson plans as an architecture for your students to formalize their research, to formalize their work, that, for example, maybe they can't start their shot list until they've shown you their treatment. They cannot start interviewing people until they've seen your interview questions. They cannot go out into the field and film until they've shown and you've signed off on their shot list. What this does is it also gives students a little bit of that back and forth with you as the instructor and the teacher to help them have a dialogue on what are they doing effectively and where maybe they can spend a little bit more time, effort, research, and intention on the work that they're doing. I highly recommend that you do this for the interviewing questions. I recommend that before the students can go out and go on in the field and film and do locations, is that one, you ensure that they've either A, gotten back their subject release form, or B, will have it done before they turn on the camera. And they also will have effective questions in these interview techniques outlined. It's recommended that you have them have more questions than they probably will need. So the different kind of lead-in open-ended questions would be, tell me about, could you describe, tell me what it was like, blah, 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 who, what, when, where, and how. Those are the best ones. It's best to front load the factual information about, tell me about, can you describe, tell me who you are, what happened, when, and then save the final ones for, how do you feel about this? Quite often getting the facts out of the way will help to have more effective emotional responses to different subject areas. And then it's very, very good practice to say, is there anything that I haven't asked you that you feel is really important you tell me, or that we need to cover before we end this interview? Because quite often we'll see that really gives you that openness that maybe in case your questions were too narrow or you didn't have enough, or it helps really the subject that you're interviewing have the most have more opportunity to kind of open up their memory and open up their response emotionally to that, to ask, is there anything you wanted to say that we forgot to cover? And obviously thank your subject for their time and participation. And if it's possible, I know it's not always possible or feasible, to give them a token of gratitude, whether it is a small thank you or a thank you card later on after you've interviewed them. It's just that nice little seal of appreciation. And also ask them at the end that, would it be okay if I follow up that after I watch this footage with more questions or even a subsequent interview? Asking those things can really ensure that should you have to go back and refilm, that you have already kind of alerted the subject matter, the interview subject. So what I'd like to show is one thing that we tend to see that can be really challenging. And I know that Wendy and I discussed this, is quite often we'll get a good interview, but maybe the actual technical quality of the interview is compromised. This is a film that I'd like to show, and I highly recommend you show this to students as best practice. These are just some common sense practices that in the industry, we just immediately go, okay, we're in the location. What's the sound of the air conditioning? Okay, air conditioning's coming from here, so we need to film across the room. So we're right underneath the air conditioning vent. Are there any alarms that are going to go off at any point in this room? Is there an elevator that's going to have a lot of deliveries in this space? Going out and scoping these locations and then figuring out kind of the environment of it, those are really, really important for students. So we're going to show you a quick video that helps them kind of just do some of those common sense practices. So then when they're actually sitting down and filming with their actual subject, they're going to get the best footage, hopefully the first time around. So let me go over to our film.
So you're ready to film your scene, and you've got your pre-production wrapped up, storyboards sketched, and your camera ready to roll, right? Wait, have you scouted your location yet?
Scouting your location is definitely worth the time and effort, because location scouting helps you identify and work out problems before the cameras are rolling and your entire production team is left standing around waiting on you. Once you've settled on a location that visually supports your story, the next two big concerns are lighting and sound. The first thing to do when you arrive at a potential location is to stop and listen. What sounds do you hear that might interfere with your shoot? Is there a loud heater or air conditioner? Lots of people talking in the background? Construction or traffic? Picking locations that don't have sound issues will save you a ton of grief in the editing room.
Next, look at the lighting. Do you want lots of light or prefer a darker setting? Are there big windows letting sunlight in? Can you control the light? What other lighting problems will you need to address?
Now that you have your location, let's focus on how to best light your subjects. We're going to focus on lighting a person, specifically their face. The goal is to give your subject dimension, so they look more real versus flat or two-dimensional. Your key light is the light that lights up their face and usually comes from just behind camera or off to one side. A rule of thumb in interview setups is to place the interviewer between the camera and the key light. A key light can be anything that reflects light. It doesn't need to be a light that plugs into the wall. It could be a window, a bounce board, a wall. Anything that is giving off light can be your key light.
Sometimes the key light creates too much contrast or fall off on your subject. If this is not the desired look, a less bright fill light can be used to help. This can be a soft light or a bounce. In the case where the lighting across the subject's face is too even, you can use something dark to create negative fill, which helps increase contrast and dimension. Finally, the hair light or backlight comes from behind the subject. This light works to separate the subject from the background, again, making the scene more dimensional and less flat.
Pro tip, when shooting in a location with lots of windows, don't shoot straight into the windows unless you have tons of light available. It's better to shoot next to the windows and have them off camera and let the light from them help you light your subject.
The best way to get good sound for your film is to minimize or remove all other competing sounds on set. If possible, capture your audio using external microphones like a boom mic or a lav mic during interviews. But if you're stuck with only the mic attached to your camera, make sure your subject is as close as possible to the camera.
Other tips to get good sound are to conduct interviews in locations that are carpeted or have rugs. These do a great job of dampening sound and reduce room echo caused by bare floors. If there's no carpet or rug, try placing a thick blanket on the ground under your subject.
Right. Just a couple of common sense practices that we have as we do interviews. A lot of this will also ensure that students are capturing really, really good quality footage. I know we're at time, and I know this is also being recorded, so I will stay a little bit longer if anyone has any particular questions. But I want to again thank Wendy as well as the Utah History Day and all the organizers for this event to allow Utah Film Center to come in and support. I hope you found some really effective tools and resources to help your students as they're working through their documentaries. We will have a second session, and if there are questions around capturing quality film, quality sound, good pre-production, production, which is filming, and post-production, which is the editing process, and also how do you edit based on feedback from the Utah History Day adjudicators, that's essentially what we're covering, Filmmaking Bootcamp. We will give you some of the best tools, tips, and practices to have really effective filming, to capture really good B-roll, good interviews, and how do you get it all together on that timeline for good, effective editing. I want to thank you again for allowing me to be here. And also there will be follow-up resources that we will use that will be available on websites that are accessed through the Utah History Day. Thank you so much, Wendy, for allowing me to be here. And thank you all so much for attending.
Thank you, Julie.
Thank you.
I'm going to stop the recording and